Right now, I'm helping Jack tie his tie and making sure he looks appropriate. The same thing I just did with Connor, his twin brother. At their 8 years old, these boys can be a bitch. I don't remember my first twins being as active as these two were at their age, but as they say, memory fades with time. Laura, my 7-year-old daughter, looks marvelous in her dress. I can't help but admire the light makeup she was allowed to wear today as a gift. She is a true replica of her mother. My gorgeous wife Claire kisses me and wishes me luck as she takes her seat. The wedding planner fusses and scurries around like a headless chicken. Actually, she's supposed to be the one running everything and keeping us all calm, but... Hey, I'm just doing what I'm told. Are you ready, Daddy? My daughter asks. I turn to look at my bride, and my breath catches. God, that smile and the sparkle in her eyes is exactly how her mother looked when she was her age. For a split second, I'm mentally transported back almost 30 years to the first time I held her naked mother in my arms. Thankfully, I ward off those ill-timed thoughts in time and offer my daughter a half-bent arm to hold on to as we prepare to walk down the aisle. As we begin this not-too-long walk to the place where we exchange vows, I look around with a sense of pride that I am here today in this position. Glancing around, I see familiar and not-so-familiar faces in the pews we pass by, and I'm reminded of how things have changed over the past 10 years. The first week of living with my mom was all about finding a new normal and getting used to it. It was for this reason that I gave myself a week's grace period before starting a new job. During that week, several things happened that showed me that everything was going to be okay. First, a couple days after moving in, I met my new neighbors. On one side of us lived an elderly couple, a husband and wife, both in their 80s, who were very nice people, although it was noticeable that they were having a hard time at their age. The old lady neighbor told me that their daughter was insisting that they move in with her, as she had plenty of room for them in the house and could look after her parents for the next few years. On the other side of our house lived a woman in her 50s, named Dee. She had lost her husband a few years ago, but now her adult son was living with her again. Dale was in his late 30s and had spent the last 8 years in the military. In the days when I met him, he was in the process of retraining to become a patient care nurse, a profession he said he would never be out of work with. I wasn't going to argue with his logic, especially when he said that what he had seen in the military had prepared him for everything. Mrs. D and Dale knew about my mother's difficult situation and had remained good neighbors to her before my father died. Dale offered his services if I ever needed them, and I immediately gratefully accepted his offer. I explained that I would need to spend a couple days a week in the office. Dee added, too, that she would be happy to help out on those days or hours when Dale would be away at his classes or he wouldn't be home. So we agreed on some financial terms, and I immediately had a neighborhood support network that proved invaluable. Working in a new place certainly benefited me, as it brought a fresh perspective and allowed me to focus. It was just me and my company allocated assistant named Claire. Claire was new to the industry, but she settled in very quickly. A big plus for both of us was her optimistic, glass is always half full attitude, which made her a cheerful and very outgoing person. When I worked in the office, Claire could bring a smile to my face at any time. She was in her early 30s and had a stunning figure that pleased my eye every time I was there. Plus, Claire often had to take the paperwork with the paperwork in-house, which meant we spent more time together. Over time, these visits became longer and longer as she preferred to stay with us for a while after finishing her business, rather than running straight home. Another piece of news that reached me shortly after I left Greenville was that on the second Monday of the month, I received a call from the real estate agency there, informing me that the key exchange had gone smoothly and that all the formalities for my old house had been taken care of. I didn't hear from Miranda, but I didn't expect to. But in the second week, I got a call from my daughter Kelly, which surprised me. None of my children had ever tried to contact me since the divorce, so this call alerted me. Kelly? I wonder what I did to deserve the honor of your call? I asked, instead of saying hello. She looked a little taken aback. Hi, Daddy. Oh, wow. So now I'm the daddy, and I thought the privilege of being called Dad belonged to good old Dan. I added a fair amount of sarcasm to my voice, wanting to make sure that Kelly was aware of everything that had happened lately. Yeah. Listen, Dad. I'm trying to call Mom. Is she home with you right now? Neither of us have talked to her since last week. And the last time we talked on the phone was when she was home with you, remember? I know Dan was at her house last week and he called and knocked on the door, but no one answered. Well, we don't know where else to look, do we? Sorry, Kelly, your mom called to discuss a couple things, and I haven't seen her since. Do you have something else? I replied rather dryly. No, nothing else. How are you doing? Too busy. Take care of yourself, I said briefly, abruptly ending the conversation. This news made me wonder what was going on with Miri, since her wedding to Dan was scheduled for the next weekend. And then I thought, what do I care about any of this? And then I grinned and went about my regular work. Over the next month, things picked up until I got my next surprise. While returning from a site inspection, I noticed a rental car parked in our driveway. When I walked to the back door, I saw my mom, and more animated than I had ever seen her in the last couple years. Talking to some unseen guests, she was cooking something in the kitchen. It should be remembered that because of her Alzheimer's disease, Mom might have had periods of lucidity, but they didn't last long, and she certainly wouldn't have been able to cook anything. As I opened the door and found myself in the kitchen, I stopped in confusion when I saw Miri, Kelly, and Cassie sitting there. My first thought of that oil painting wasn't very censorious, and the ones that followed were no better. "What the hell are you guys doing here?" I lashed out at the trio. "Alan, is that any way to treat your wife? I expected better from you." Mom shook her hands and told me off. "I was just telling Miri that we'd recently lost our father. That really struck me, since my mom had never responded to my attempts to explain to her what had happened to my father. Unfortunately, that just proves once again how confusing this illness of hers was." Miri only shook her head slightly as my mom continued to talk about something I couldn't even remember while simultaneously taking cookies out of the oven. Kelly didn't even have the courage to look at me, sitting stiffly with her head down next to my ex-wife. Cassie looked a little haggard and gaunt, dark circles around her eyes. Of course, Mom's brief period of mental clarity, as well as the surge of vitality, soon began to wane, and I took her into the bedroom to lie down, but not before Mom asked me who the three women were and how they'd ended up in our kitchen. When I got back in, I noticed that the cookies were not cooked properly, and a little taste test revealed that my poor mom had used salt instead of sugar. Dealing with this only briefly delayed the confrontation that was about to happen. "What's going on? Why are you here, Mrs. Roberts?" Finally, turning to face them, I began. "I'm still Dowd, Alan," she corrected. "A lot of things have changed lately. The main thing is that Dan... he passed away recently, and that's why we're all here." Miri's answer caught me off guard, making me freeze in place. Wait a minute. You're just saying that? I need a lot more information." After a pause, I reacted after a moment of confusion. "Like I said, a lot has happened since the last time I saw you. After we talked, I spent a few days at the old house, trying to think things through and come to my senses," Miranda began. "Then I left and spent a few days with Sandy, which was even more helpful. I confided in her about all the stupid things I'd done and mistakes. And I told her the truth. Being with her helped me a lot. Rob was in California at the time, meeting with clients, so I was able to share some information with her about him too, which made Sandy carry out her threat that she'd mentioned in her phone conversation with you. You might hear from her soon, We talked to her about that too, Miri explained. We'll see, I replied, chuckling inwardly at the thought of the two women discussing me like that. Anyway, I was there for about a week. I watched the kids while Sandy and Rob worked out their relationship. You know, in all that time, I only got 3 texts from Dan asking where I was. So I ignored them, but I got hundreds of messages from the kids and our relatives. I think that told me more than anything else, Miri said with a sour grimace. Sandy promised not to tell anyone that I was there, even though no one asked. I came back the Friday before the wedding was supposed to take place, only to tell everyone that it was canceled. I was curious as to what then happened to my ex-wife's work husband of many years, causing these 3 women to now be in my mom and I's house. Dan didn't say anything, just packed a bag and left, Miranda continued. It turned out that he had gone to see his girlfriend, Tilly, from Chicago, and that had been his last mistake. Tilly's husband had come home early from a business trip to surprise her. Kelly and Cassie fidgeted awkwardly in their chairs. Both of their faces were somber, and the girls' eyes looked down at the floor. As far as could be determined, Dan had climbed out onto the balcony of their apartment, unaware that they were having trouble with the railing, and had fallen from the 2nd floor and smashed his head. Death was instantaneous. She was silent for a few seconds before she continued. The funeral took place a couple days ago. Lucky for me, he'd already put my name on a lot of insurance policies when we started living together. Cassie was also well taken care of, but on her father's life insurance policy, the company said they wouldn't pay for Dan's death because the railing problem had been mentioned several times, but the management company never did anything about it. That's the reason we're here. Well, and also because I miss you so much after realizing how stupid I've been. That last statement made me raise my eyebrows in surprise. There was no way in hell I was going back to her, no matter how miserable she looked right now. I think she knew that too, just trying to fish in troubled waters. How are you doing, Cassie? I asked sympathetically. Yeah, I think I'm okay, she said for the first time. It was funny, but he didn't seem like a real father. He was more like kind of a close buddy, and I miss that. Miri was definitely more like a mom because she was always there for me. After my real mom died. And Dad, what can I say? Well, yeah, I miss him, but, Before she could finish, Cassie just stopped talking. Everyone knows the truth now, Alan. Miranda spoke softly again. I haven't kept anything from anyone. And the truth is that you were right. For years, the kids have been turned against you just because I took their time away from you, spending it with Dan and his family. Kelly now understands much better how all of us being estranged, disappointed, and hurt you by doing so. Luke, on the other hand, is angry about all of this. I think he feels the same way Cassie just described. Dan treated him just like a buddy and didn't patronize him the way you did. He was easy on Dan, and because of that, he became attached to him. Now Luke blames me for everything, and it's for the best because I only have myself to blame for everything. I screwed up because I got mad when I thought you cheated on me with Sandy, Miri concluded. I just stared at all of them for a minute with a studied look, letting the silence linger. Well, it was time to make a decision. Okay, hold on a second, I said to my ex-wife. I walked over to the small safe that stood in the corner of the office and pulled out an envelope that I had kept for the last 10 years or so. It was supposed to be a present for their 21st birthday, but I guess now was as good a time as any. Miri, I said, look at the girls and tell me what you see. I don't need to look, she said. They could be sisters. That's what everyone around here always said about them. The only thing they differed in was hair color. Well, and Cassie had Laura's eyes. Both girls looked a little confused, not sure why I was making this conversation. Yeah, you're right. So the reason Kelly and Cassie look alike is because they're sisters, I announced, handing the envelope to Cassie. What the hell, Alan? You didn't even know Laura when you and I were in high school?" Miri exclaimed in great confusion. "That's right. You and I were still high school students at that time. But don't you remember what Laura was doing before she got pregnant?" I asked, walking over to the wall and pointing to a framed newspaper clipping my father had always admired and treasured. Dad would have been happy if I had followed my dream of a brilliant career in baseball, but alas, not all of our dreams come true. "Yes, she worked at the local newspaper," Miranda replied. "Do you remember her maiden name?" I asked her another leading question. "Bicknell," Cassie said, keeping her head down as she stared at the envelope she was holding but hadn't opened. With that response from Cassie, I took the framed article off the wall and handed it to Miri. I knew she had read it several times because she was so proud of this printed testament to my high school sports glory when we were younger. She just never paid attention to who the reporter was who wrote the memo. We met with her a few times while she was working on the article, and a couple more times after it was already out. Laura found out that Dan had been cheating on her shortly after they were married when he contracted an STD, and so she used me for revenge sex. If you remember, I was a perpetually horny teenager at the time, and having an older woman give me obvious signs of attention was a gift from heaven to me. So, no, Miri, I have not remained absolutely faithful to you, although what happened between Laura and me happened before she got married. I think that should ease your guilt. It's just that you got the name wrong. I didn't see her for months after that, until you befriended her shortly before the twins were born, and at that point, I didn't even know I had gotten her pregnant. She later told me that she was going to divorce Dan, but then she found out she was pregnant and decided to turn him into an ignorant cuckold by bringing him another man's baby in retaliation. "Wow, so you and I really are sisters," Kelly exclaimed, grabbing Cassie's hands with a wide, bright smile on her face, which she responded to with equal enthusiasm. You could see from Miranda's face that she was completely stunned. Although Cassie hadn't opened the envelope yet, I knew that inside it was a documented DNA test that confirmed what I'd said, as well as a letter from Laura explaining what had happened and why. "Before you ask," I spoke again, "Laura and I did not rekindle our affair anew after you and she became close friends." "Well, at least that was the case until she found out that you started hanging around with Dan after my incident with Sandy. It was kind of ironic that you went back to her when you left me that morning, because she let me know what you were thinking at the time. You were going to hit the bars looking for adventure. It didn't work out, though, because Laura got you so drunk that you couldn't even try to go hunting, and then she talked you out of it. Then, a few months later, she found your panties at her house. She knew they belonged to you because she was with you when you bought them. I revealed something else from the past that Miri didn't realize. So Laura found out who Dan's new girlfriend was because, as you know, we all thought she had completely lost interest in sex. But the real truth was that after Cassie was born, she never wanted to have sex with Dan again. I can assure you, I grinned, that Laura was very sexy, and when you were spending time with Dan, your best friend was spending time with me. You told everyone that you had 2 husbands, and everyone thought I'd be furious if I found out. I didn't care, though, since I had 2 wives. And from what Laura said, I had no reason to care compared to Dan, I said, shrugging my shoulders. Instead of getting angry with me, Miri suddenly laughed a nervous laugh. "So that's what this is all about. Of course, it couldn't even occur to us that between you two..." Damn, how stupid we were. Dan even tried to make jokes about it. He wanted me to cut you off completely, but I wasn't gonna do it. Maybe it's my vengeance overriding my judgment, but a girl's got to get her needs met anyway. You probably don't care, Alan, but, Dan could never replace you on this one, honestly. That's why I almost fell in love with you before I left. I knew what I was giving up. God, stupid me and my stupid stubbornness, she almost moaned. Now Miranda's eyes were glistening with tears, either from laughter or pain, or maybe a mixture of both. And it wasn't the reaction I'd expected from her. The girls had finally opened the letter and were now reading it, heads bowed and whispering to each other. Tears trembled in Cassie's eyes as she looked at the words written in her mother's hand. "Are you okay, Cassie?" I asked again. Yeah, I'm fine, thank you." "Papa," she said, looking up at me, with wet streaks of tears on her cheeks, but at the same time with a big smile. We talked for a couple more hours before they all left for the hotel they had booked. Kelly apologized often, repenting for her past behavior and trying to build bridges. I was fine with that, though I decided to move forward with caution. Cassie, on the other hand, simply and quite sincerely, wanted to be as close to me as possible. Miri said she didn't know what she was going to do now, since there was no reason for her to stay in Windsor or North Carolina in general. She asked me how I would feel about her moving to the area. I replied that it would be her choice, but immediately warned her that I wasn't going to go back to the way things had been between us before. She agreed to that, but said it would be nice to have a friend around. I was able to sort out the insurance issue without any problems, and after that, life went on as usual. 4 months later, my mom died. Everyone attended her funeral, even Luke, though we hadn't exchanged a word in the 3 days he'd been there. After that, I withdrew all support from him. If Luke wanted to continue acting like a hostile asshole, I wasn't going to fund him in any way. Our relationship never recovered afterward, though he kept in touch with Miranda and his sisters. However, I knew that Miri never paid Luke's tuition either, so he had to earn his own money. We later learned that Miri's parents helped him with the money. Since I no longer had anything in common with them, I didn't care what they did. After that first visit, Miranda subsequently visited me every 2 or 3 weeks thereafter, and she and I never once progressed to any closer physical contact. In fact, my ex-wife had been instrumental in unobtrusively drawing my attention to the way Claire behaved when she was around me, and it had resulted in her and I becoming much closer than an insurance manager and his assistant should be. Before throwing myself headlong into the maelstrom of love, I had to notify the owners of the company of my and Claire's budding relationship, and they wanted to meet and discuss the matter with both of us. After explaining to us that the company had no prohibitions about relationships in the workplace, they still wanted to know how serious our intentions and plans for each other were. Claire summed up the conversation by telling them, "I'm not too worried about the future as I expect to go on maternity leave. If I can just get that idiot to realize how I feel about him, and then the time is right." Eventually, Miri moved into our neighborhood and found a new job here. She and Claire had grown quite close, which seemed a bit strange to me personally. However, my focus was only on Claire and our relationship, so if she was comfortable with my ex, what did it matter to me? As time went on, I found that I could talk to Miri normally as before. Everything between us seemed to be back to normal. It was just that we weren't sleeping in the same bed. I could see in her eyes, though, that if I'd said a word, she would have been there in a heartbeat, arms open. Yes. I'd heard that Miri had dated someone, but she'd never gotten serious with anyone. That was her choice, though. After a year of dating and many dates, Claire and I were married. The next year after that happy event, we had twins, and a year later, our youngest, whom we named Laura. And now, as I walk down the aisle, I am reminded of my story and the winding road to happiness, which was by no means rose-tinted. I see Peter, Kelly's husband, sitting in the pew with our second granddaughter, Chloe. After graduation, Kelly and Cassie went on a 6-month tour of Europe together. While they were in Denmark and walking around Copenhagen, Kelly met Peter and fell in love with him. He probably felt the same way about her, because a year later he secured his transfer from Deutsche Bank's branch there to their Miami office, and Kelly moved in with him. They married a couple years later, and Chloe came along shortly thereafter. I said this girl is our second granddaughter, and I never got to meet my first grandchild yet. Luke and his girlfriend had an unplanned pregnancy, and as a result, they had a little boy named Daniel. Miri met him a couple times, but she had to travel to Atlanta to see her grandson. Luke himself, by the way, has already split up with this girl and is now just a weekend dad who pays child support for his child. This is probably the 8th or 9th time in the last 10 years that we've been in the same room together, each time pretending to barely notice each other, and I'm fine with that. I haven't put up any walls between us, but Luke knows where I am if he wants to get over his ego one day. Everyone else in the family lets him know what an asshole he is, but he still gets invitations to family gatherings, just out of courtesy. What can I say about Cassie? Oh, she looks absolutely stunning as we solemnly stride hand in hand toward Carl, her fiancé, waiting for us at the altar at the end of the aisle. When the ceremony is over, she will carry the last name Cassie Turner Dowd, and I'm sure Laura, her mom, is smiling at this moment, looking down from heaven at her happy, radiant little girl. All in all, things haven't worked out too badly for me. I'll be 50 in a couple years, have a wonderful, loving wife, 6 kids, okay, 5 if you don't count Luke, a beautiful granddaughter, and a bright future.